Good afternoon, I'm Modern Warfare Historian and welcome back to the Warfare 1 Operation series. Last time, in a very long video, we discussed the engagements at Deniki, Ioribaiwa and Eora Creek, while also taking a detour south to the Milne Bay area. The battles of Deniki, Ioribaiwa and Eora Creek were delaying actions, as the Australians were still being pushed back towards Port Moresby. However, the Allies had a huge advantage on their side, logistics. Armies march on the stomach, and a stomach can almost only be filled by logistics. By this time, the Japanese had almost no logistic, having overextended their supply lines, and this would prove to be their fatal mistake. Now, let's get started. The Japanese pursuit party went down the slope and passed through Kaji on the 6th of September. Soon after, they stumbled across an Australian camp south of Fuji. The expectations of the Japanese troops that they would soon reach the plains of Port Moresby after crossing the path were soon dashed. Mountain after mountain stretched in front of them as far as the eye could see. Japanese morale was starting to get low. The Australians were not in a better shape. Both the 39th and 53rd Battalion were now unavailable, as those were sent back to rest after the heavy fighting in Ioribaiwa. Therefore, on the 7th of September, only the 21st Brigade remained, composed of the following. The 227th was in the further north position of the track, in a rhomboid-like defensive position. The 214th was just behind the 227th, position in line formation perpendicular to the Counterattack. The 216th was dispersed along the track south of the 214th. The Brigade HQ was on Brigade Hill. By the way, take all these maps with a grain of salt, as sources on the matter are not very precise on various dispositions. The Australians also had some pop-on units used to carry supplies and evacuate the wounded, and two detachments of the 26th and the 14th Field Ambulances. They also had three 3-inch mortars that had been dropped at Miola previously. Since in the last battles they only had one, I do believe that the remaining two were dropped in these days. The Australians had a lot of cases of people with problems at their feet, mainly because of the very long walking sessions in uneven terrain, and cases of dysentery. This, however, also affected heavily the Japanese. The terrain offers good flanking opportunities from the north, and that's exactly what the Japanese planned doing. The Japanese attack plan was as follows. The 3rd Battalion, minus 9th Company, will attack along the Counterattack. The attack will commence at 7 p.m. on the 7th of September. The 2nd Battalion, plus some engineering units, will flank the enemy from the north. The 9th Company of the 3rd Battalion, plus the rest of the engineers, will remain as a reserve near the regimental headquarters. The Japanese had in the units of the South Sea Detachment on the front line of the Counterattack, other than the 144th Regiment and 1 Battalion of the 31st, also 1 company of engineers. We have found sources that indicate that, on the flanking maneuver, 1/4 of the force took part, while the rest was near the 9th Company. We therefore assume that the force that joined the 2nd Battalion was of the strength of 1 platoon. The Japanese had also artillery support that had previously been used in other battles and was a big danger to the Australians. The Emperor of the Rising Sun, however, had a big weakness, the lack of air power in the region. On the morning of the 7th, the Japanese were attacked by Allied aircraft. On the following day, another raid, done by 8 B-26 bombers and 4 P-40s, caused a lot of casualties. Some reports indicate 11 deaths and 20 wounded, while the Japanese reported a total of 100 casualties in a telegraph from Major General Hori to the 17th Army Headquarters. The attack started on the evening of the 7th with an artillery bombardment and with the frontal attack of the 3rd Battalion. In the meantime, just as planned, the 2nd Battalion were flanking the Australians with the help of a Papuan guide, and were moving under the cover of darkness between the 2nd Battalion and the Brigade headquarters. As the Japanese 2nd Battalion attacked the gap between the enemy Brigade HQ and the enemy battalions, the Australians' communications were destroyed as, literally, the signal wire was cut. This put the headquarters in a difficult position, and 1 company of the 227th was ordered back towards the headquarters, that in the meantime was moved towards Menari, while the 214th and 216th were ordered to reorientate towards south. However, due to communication difficulties and a misunderstanding, the whole front collapsed as the 227th fell back. The 214th and 216th attacked the Japanese 2nd Battalion, and some Japanese platoons were overrun. Sadly for the Aussies, the attack bogged down when the Japanese were able to stabilize their position with some reinforcements, and caused heavy casualties to the Australians. Potts' brigade was already depleted heavily, and the carrying of the wounded did not help the matter. The wounded slowed any movement, and some of them needed stretchers. And when I say some, I mean a lot of them. To give you a number, around 120 men at a time were needed to transport the wounded, as those could not be left behind, because the Japanese would torture them and then execute them. Also, the Papuan stretchers were not used in the front line, but only in the rear areas. One Australian company, the company of the 216th, that was held back to protect the Brigade HQ, was used to try and break the encirclement from the south, but was unable to complete its objective and suffered heavy casualties. At that moment, Potts recognized that the position was lost and ordered a withdrawal to the south. The Australians were able to break contact thanks to a counterattack from B and D companies of the 227th. The Brigade headquarters and the company of the 216th went down the Kokoda track, while the battalions of the brigade were able to flee using the mountains, going down southwest. The Australians suffered 87 killed and 77 wounded, while the Japanese suffered 60 killed and 165 wounded. The 214th and the 216th were able to reunite with the brigade headquarters at Menari, but the 227th was unable to arrive at Menari before the rest of the brigade was forced back again. Should also be noted that when the 216th arrived, the position was already under artillery and machine gun fire. The 227th was then forced to follow a parallel track to the Kokoda one. Their detour would prove to be a very harsh one, as they had to endure it under heavy rains, with limited rations and with a lot of wounded men. However, the Australians would not lose, albeit temporarily, just the 227th, but also their commanding officer. In fact, Brigadier Arnold Potts was relieved of command by his superiors, as they were not pleased by the fact that the Japanese were still advancing. We could start a debate on the matter, yet at the same time we don't want to annoy you with all the bureaucratic and administrative side of things. So we will cut short by simply saying that he was replaced and his successor was Brigadier Selwyn Porter. So at the end of the Battle of Ioribaiwa, also called Battle of Mission Ridge, Brigade Hill, the Australians were retreating. They have lost in the jungle one battalion and their commander on the field has been replaced. Oh, and the Japanese are right behind them. The Japanese were suffering very heavy logistic problems and also had to guard their backs. As the Allied offensive in the Solomon area was draining more and more resources, the 17th Army, that was the unit that commanded the South Seas Detachment, ordered Lieutenant General Hori to send one battalion of the 31st Regiment towards Buna, in fear of enemy landing there that would cut off the force on the Kokoda track, as Buna was the place where all the logistics for the 144th and 41st Regiment were arriving. Another battalion was sent to Kokoda while another was kept back at Fuji. And these two movements were done in order to shorten the supply lines of at least some units. The Japanese situation was not good, while the Australians one was starting to become better. The 214th and 216th, after heavy fighting in the previous battles, were merged in a composite battalion, composed of around 200 to 300 soldiers, divided into companies. The good news for the Aussies was that reinforcements were arriving, and in big numbers. These reinforcements were the 3rd Battalion, that was placed under the command of the 21st Brigade, the 2nd Pioneer Battalion, that however was not on the front line at the moment, some patrols of the 26th Independent Company. Last but surely not least, the Australians also received an entire fresh brigade, the 25th Brigade, composed of the 225th, the 231st and 233rd Battalion. These positions on the Ioribaiwa Ridge were as follows. The composite battalion held the center left position, while the center right position was assigned to the 3rd Battalion. The 231st held the furthermost position to the left, while on the opposite side, on the right flank, there was the 233rd. The 225th, that was the last to arrive, was kept as a reserve behind, to be committed in case of emergency. However, most of the forces of these units were unable to deploy as the Japanese used their now classic infiltration tactics, and on the 13th, with the help of artillery fire, attacked the Australians and, after days, forced them in a difficult position, either retreat to the last two ridge before Port Moresby or risking being eliminated there. The Australians had, for probably one of the first time in the campaign, superior numbers, with almost 3,000 soldiers against 1,600 strong Japanese force, giving them an advantage of 1.8 to 1. The Australians resorted to ambush tactics to fight the Japanese patrols, as they did a lot of time before, and caused heavy casualties. The 1st 25th Brigade was ordered to counterattack with the 231st and 233rd, probably with the idea of doing a double pincer movement. However, the Japanese ruined their plan. The Japanese launched an attack with a force of 2 battalions and forced the Australians into a defensive posture. On the 14th, the 3rd Battalion of the Japanese 144th Regiment attacked the Composite Battalion, and, supported by their artillery, were able in breaking the Central Australian line and forcing the Australian Composite Battalion to move slightly south, but not too much. To the west, the Japanese 2nd Battalion, 144th Regiment, encountered the 231st Battalion, and heavy fighting followed. The following day, the 15th, part of the Japanese 8th Company, 3rd Battalion, were able to find a small gap between the Australian 3rd Battalion and the 2nd 33rd, and seized the opportunity. The Japanese had now a great firing position that put the Aussies in a difficult position, but were unable to progress further because of a counterattack from the 225th. At the same time, the Australian counterattack of the 225th failed to dislodge the enemy, that started entrenching its position. Both factions started to do small unit counterattacks, but none saw success, and the situation soon became a stalemate. The Japanese could not advance further as they had no reinforcement. However, the Australian commander, Brigadier Kenneth Eater, decided to fall back to Ioribaiwa Ridge, the last mountain ridge between them and the flat terrain in Port Moresby. Here, the Australians had to defend every inch of ground to the death. There was no step backwards. The Japanese had won this engagement, but a heavy price. Around 36 to 40 Japanese were killed, with around 120 wounded in action. The Australians lost 49 men and had 121 wounded, most of these caused by enemy artillery fire. On the 20th of September, the Australian position at the Ioribaiwa Ridge were as follows. On the left, the 2nd Pioneer Battalion that had just arrived. Going towards the right, we have in order the 231st, the 225th, the 3rd Battalion, and on the position further to the right, the 233rd. The brigade quarters was behind the 225th. Here the Australians started doing frequent patrols because their fresh units had enough time to dig in and rest after the retreat. These patrols were able to inflict heavy casualties on the Japanese patrols with ambushes. Before, at Ioribaiwa, only the Composite Battalion was in the position to send patrols, while the other units were not yet in position, but the Australian soldiers of the Composite Battalion were in low numbers there, so patrols could not be conducted. The Japanese had a huge moral boost as they could now see the lights of Port Moresby, but at the same time the bad logistical situation was starving them. On the contrary, the Australian logistical situation was now good enough to support 2 brigades, and the Aussies had now even artillery support in form of 2 25-pounders that had been brought up the mountains by hands, and were now in range to hit the Japanese. This new amount of resources shifted the balance of force heavily in the hands of the Allied, who were now planning a counterattack, and most importantly, now they could physically do one. On the 26th, the Japanese units withdrew back to Ioribaiwa and started taking a defensive posture. The Japs had almost no food left, with extreme rations of 180mm of rice a day. To quote Japanese Mayor Koiwai, "Our bodies were completely fatigued, so climbing even the smallest hill required a grave effort. The majority of members of the units were carrying wounded on stretchers. My battalion 7th Company was meant to be protecting the rear, but they were carrying casualties from the field hospital, as were members of the 4th Wireless Radio Unit. Because there was no life-sustaining rise, every step seemed to exhaust one's entire strength. Progress was exceedingly slow, as we climbed the mountain, counting each step, gasping for each breath. Despite some encouragement to struggle through the pain, many were stooped over, their eyes filled with tears, and without even the strength to urge themselves on. My heart was filled with sorrow." Also, because of the threat of an Allied landing at Buna, behind the force in the Counterattack, and with risk of being encircled there, Commander Hori had to cancel the offensive. The Japanese were able to receive some food supplies via airlift on the 23rd of September, but this was not enough. The Japanese started retreating towards Kokoda, and the Australians were pursuing them. On the first 2 days of October, the Australians started to advance. The Aussies found Ioribaiwa empty, and they advanced further. Minari, Effuji, and other small places that during the Australian retreat saw heavy combat were now retaken with little resistance. As small news for those who were asking, the Australian 227th Battalion that had disappeared into the jungle weeks ago was now able to find the Australians on the 22nd of September. They would later be sent to Port Moresby to rest, and at the end of October, one company of this battalion was used to bring supplies and bring back wounded from the Counterattack. The Japanese had planned a defense in depth in the Eora Creek area. The 2nd Battalion of the 144th Regiment created 4 defensive lines. The first 2 were between Kaji and Eora, the 3rd was at Templeton Crossing, and the 4th was in the Ioribaiwa village. There were some engagement on the 8th of October around Eora, when units of the 225th engaged the Japanese defenses there. 2 days after, on the 10th, Eora was occupied. On the 11th, Australian positions were as follows. The 233rd was advancing towards Templeton Crossing. The 235th was on Mount Bellamy track, that was the track parallel to the Kokoda one that connects Eora with Kaji. The 3rd Battalion was at Eora, and the 231st was at Kaji. The Australians had also the 16th Brigade, composed of 4 battalions, the 2st, 2nd, 2/3, and 2/4th, and these units had landed in Port Moresby when the Japanese were threatening the city with their attack at Ioribaiwa and Ioribaiwa Ridge. This brigade was coming up the Counterattack and was around Menari. The 2nd Battle of Eora Creek was actually a series of engagement, not just a single battle. The first major 2 were near Eora. The Japanese had in the area the first 2 defensive positions, one near Eora with 520 men, and one on the Mount Bellamy track with around 150 men. The first contact on the Eora position was done on the 10th of October by units of the 233rd Battalion. C Company joined the fight on the next day, while the rest of the battalion arrived on the 12th. The Australian 3rd Battalion tried a flanking maneuver on the western flank and attacked the Japanese position on the 15th, together with a frontal attack by the 233rd. However, the Japanese had already retreated, and the positions were found empty. On the Mount Bellamy track, the 225th encountered the Japanese on the 13th of October, and on the 15th the enemy positions were clear and the battalion could advance. The next major engagement was near Templeton Crossing. The Australian 3rd Battalion was in the front, and its D Company found the Japanese position on the afternoon of the 16th of October. On the 2 following days, the Australians would try to attack the Japanese from the high ground on the eastern side of the creek, with the 3rd Battalion and A and D Company of the 225th, but the results were limited. On the 20th of October, the 2nd mounted an attack from the high ground to the east. The idea was that 2 companies would climb the slopes near the track and do a localized flanking maneuver, while 2 other companies would do a bigger flanking maneuver and attack from behind. The Australian advance was slow mainly because the Japanese had created a formidable defense in depth, with entrenched positions that had to be taken one by one. The following day, the Australians attacked again, but found the enemy position empty as the Japanese had retreated during the night. The Aussies therefore started their advance on 2 parallel tracks, and on the evening of the 21st, both columns were ambushed near Eora Creek. The Japanese had prepared 2 main defensive zones, one near the riverbank and one further behind and above, and both zones had a lot of machine guns. At 4 a.m., the Australians started a silent night crossing of the 2 bridges in the Eora Creek, and 2 companies were able to cross those before the Japanese noticed them and opened fire, pinning them down, yet even a 3rd company was able to cross with small casualties. 2 companies of the 2/3 were ordered to flank the Japanese from the west, but progress was slow as the enemy had created, once again, a formidable defense in depth, and because the terrain was very difficult. On the night of the 28th of October, Hori ordered a withdrawal, and the 1st 144th, 2nd 144th, and the artillery were sent back, leaving only the 3rd 144th and the 2nd 41st as a rearguard, although the unit of the 144th were soon withdrew as well. The Japanese forces were attacked on the 28th, and the Japanese were able to occupy the enemy position. The Japanese were causing heavy casualties and slowing down the Australians, but at the same time they were losing a lot of manpower and were retreating. Still, the Allied commanders, especially MacArthur and Thomas Blamey, were convinced that their advance was too slow, so Major General Allen was relieved from command on the 29th of October, and the command was given to Major General Joe Bazzi. The battles around Eora Creek were bloody and violent, as much as the ones that were fought in the same part of the track during the Japanese advance, with the only difference that the parts were now inverted. The Australians were advancing while the Japanese were retreating. From the 12th of October to the 28th, the Australians suffered 412 killed or wounded against 244 Japanese casualties. Of these, between the 22nd and the 28th, the Aussies lost 72 killed in action and 152 wounded in action, and the Japanese had 64 KIA and 70 wounded in action. So 54% of the Australian losses were suffered near Eora Creek, as well as 55% of the Japanese one. On the 29th, the Australians' advance restarted, divided in 3 axes of advance. One composed of the 231st Battalion, which advanced along the main track and the Ioribaiwa Ridge line to the east. On another, the 25th Brigade followed a parallel track to the east of Eora Creek. Third axis, the 3rd Battalion secured Eora. At the same time, the Japanese started fortifying Buna and Gona in anticipation of the important battle that would be fought there. Aola was entered on the 30th of October, and airdrops there alleviated supply bombs as the Australian line of communication extended from Yola. This brings an end to our video. I hope you've enjoyed this. I do believe that this video will maybe be followed by a couple more before we will have to take a short break around the end of August and the start of September for personal reasons. Thank you for watching, and remember to always be in good physical shape in case you need to bring, by hands, an artillery gun to the top of a mountain.